Let me start by saying something that most people are not ready to hear. And honestly, most people don't believe until it happens to them. If a police officer follows you for more than 2 miles, the decision to stop you has already been made. You're just watching the setup play out in real time. That sounds extreme, maybe even paranoid, but it isn't. It's not about conspiracy, it's about pattern recognition. Something I've developed after reviewing hundreds of body camera videos, dash cam footage, and sitting through suppression hearings where every second of an encounter gets dissected like a crime scene. And when you watch enough of these, you start to notice something unsettling. The stop rarely begins when the lights come on. It begins much earlier. There's a phrase I want you to remember, and I don't want you to just hear it. I want you to internalize it, rehearse it, almost to the point where it feels automatic under stress. That phrase is this: the stop starts before the lights. Say it again in your head. The stop starts before the lights. Because by the time those red and blue lights flash behind you, the officer is not deciding whether to pull you over. That decision has already been made, sometimes minutes earlier. What they're doing in that window, those 2 miles, 3 miles, however long it lasts, is building a reason. Now this is the part most people misunderstand. They think police stops are spontaneous, reactive. Oh, I must have done something wrong just now. But in reality, many stops are proactive. An officer gets curious. Maybe it's your driving pattern. Maybe it's your car. Maybe it's the area you're in. Maybe it's something as subtle as how you glanced in your mirror. Curiosity turns into suspicion, and suspicion looks for confirmation. And confirmation, in the legal world, needs a hook. It needs something that can be articulated later in a report, something that sounds objective when it's written down. Failure to maintain lane, following too closely, expired tag light, small, almost forgettable infractions that suddenly become the legal justification for a stop that, in reality, began with a hunch. This is where it gets complicated, because the law does allow this, within limits. An officer needs reasonable suspicion to initiate a stop, but what qualifies as reasonable is often shaped after the fact. That's why those 2 miles matter. That's the observation window. That's the period where they're watching you, waiting, sometimes even hoping for a minor violation they can point to. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If someone follows you long enough, they will usually find something. Maybe you drift slightly within your lane. Maybe you touch the line for a second. Maybe your speed fluctuates by a few miles per hour. These are normal human behaviors, but under observation, they become evidence. The stop starts before the lights. Let me walk you through a scenario I've seen more times than I can count. You're driving at night, maybe a little tired, maybe just heading home. You notice a car behind you. At first, it doesn't register. Then you realize it's still there after a few turns. Then it stays behind you through a light. Then another turn, and now you're aware of it. Your behavior changes. You grip the wheel tighter. You check your mirrors more often. Your mind starts racing. Am I doing something wrong? And that's when it happens. You overcorrect slightly. You hesitate at a yellow light. You tap your brakes a little too hard. Completely human reactions, but now you're under a microscope. From the officer's perspective, this is confirmation. Nervous driving, inconsistent speed, slight lane deviation. From your perspective, you're just reacting to being followed. This is the trap. And it's not always intentional in a malicious sense, but it is a predictable psychological loop. Observation creates pressure. Pressure creates behavior. Behavior becomes justification. Now let me be honest with you. None of this means the officer is automatically wrong or acting illegally. There are legitimate reasons for proactive policing, but it does mean you need to understand the dynamic you're in, because misunderstanding it is where people get into real trouble. The moment you realize you're being followed for an extended distance, you need to shift your mindset, not into panic, but into awareness. Because again, the stop starts before the lights. What most people do in that moment is exactly what makes things worse. They start driving unnaturally. They try to be perfect, which ironically makes them look more suspicious. They slow down too much, or they become overly rigid, or they keep checking their mirrors in a way that signals anxiety. Officers are trained to read behavior, not just violations. They're watching your hands, your posture, your head movements, your reactions to their presence. And here's where psychology comes into play. An officer following you for 2 miles is not just looking for a traffic violation. They're forming a narrative. They're asking themselves, does this person look like someone I should stop? And every small behavior feeds into that narrative. Now here's where it turns. Let's say the lights finally come on. Your heart rate spikes. Adrenaline hits. Your hands might shake slightly. Your breathing changes. This is a physiological response. You don't control it. But the officer is now interpreting everything they see through the lens of suspicion they've already built. This is why your behavior after the stop matters just as much as before. But before we even get there, let's talk about something most people never consider. There are cases, real cases I've handled, where the defense hinges on that pre-stop period, where we go back and look at the footage and ask, what was the officer really doing for those 2 miles? In one case, an officer followed a driver for nearly 3 miles before initiating a stop for failure to maintain lane. When we reviewed the dash cam, the deviation was minimal, something you would barely notice in normal driving. But what stood out was how long the officer had been trailing the vehicle. In court, that matters, because it raises the question, were they observing or were they fishing? And that distinction can be the difference between a lawful stop and a constitutional violation. But here's the hard truth. Even if you're right, even if the stop is questionable, even if it gets thrown out later, you still have to go through the stop. You still deal with the inconvenience, the stress, the potential search, the time lost. Asserting your rights does not mean avoiding the situation, it means managing it. Let me be honest with you, that's the part people don't like. There's no magic phrase that makes an officer drive away. There's no script that guarantees you won't be stopped. But there is a way to handle it that protects you legally, and it starts with understanding what not to do. When those lights come on, your instinct might be to explain yourself immediately, to talk, to justify, to say, I was just trying to get home, or I didn't realize I was drifting, or I was nervous because you were following me. That instinct is human, but it can be damaging, because every statement you make becomes part of the record, and officers are trained to ask questions in a way that invites you to fill in gaps. Do you know why I pulled you over? That question is not for information, it's an opportunity. Now here's where that central phrase comes back into play, not just conceptually, but practically. The stop starts before the lights, which means by the time you're speaking to the officer, the narrative already exists. Your job is not to rewrite that narrative in the moment. Your job is to avoid strengthening it. Calm, neutral responses, minimal information, respectful but controlled interaction, and your body language matters more than you think. Slow movements, hands visible, no sudden gestures. Not because you're hiding anything, but because perception drives escalation. If you look agitated, if your movements are erratic, if your tone shifts even slightly, that can be interpreted as nervousness or even threat. Again, not necessarily fair, but very real. And let's talk about adrenaline for a moment, because this is something people underestimate. When you're being followed and then stopped, your body enters a stress response. Your vision can narrow, your hearing can change, your memory becomes less reliable. That's why people later say, I didn't mean to say that, or I don't remember agreeing to that search. It's not that they're lying, it's that their brain was in survival mode. This is why preparation matters. Not paranoia, not fear, just awareness. Because when you understand that the stop starts before the lights, you stop reacting emotionally to that moment and start navigating it deliberately. Now, what happens if they ignore you? What happens if you do everything right? Calm demeanor, minimal answers, and the officer keeps pushing, keeps probing, keeps asking questions that feel intrusive? This is where people get uncomfortable, because asserting your rights politely can still create tension. An officer may not like that you're not engaging the way they expect. They may repeat questions. They may change tone slightly. That doesn't mean you escalate. It means you stay consistent, respectful, calm, unmoved. Because inconsistency is what creates openings. And here's another nuance people miss. Officers are human. Some are professional and straightforward. Others rely more heavily on psychological pressure. They may use silence. They may use repetition. They may use subtle intimidation. Not always aggressively, but enough to make you second-guess yourself. Why are you so nervous? Even if you weren't nervous before, now you are. And now your behavior changes again. This is why understanding the full timeline matters. From the moment they start following you, to the moment they walk up to your window, to the moment they ask that first question. It's all one continuous interaction, not separate events. The stop starts before the lights. And once you see it that way, you start to understand how much of the encounter is shaped before you even realize you're in one. So what do you do with that knowledge? You don't panic. You don't assume guilt. You don't try to outsmart the officer in real time. You stay controlled. You stay aware. You avoid feeding a narrative that's already in motion. And most importantly, you prepare yourself mentally before it ever happens. Because in that moment, you won't rise to the level of your expectations. You'll fall to the level of your preparation. So rehearse the idea. Internalize the phrase. Let it become something that surfaces automatically when you notice that car behind you lingering a little too long. The stop starts before the lights. And if you understand that, really understand it, you won't just react to the stop. You'll recognize it while it's still unfolding.